You've probably lied today, and honestly, it was probably no big deal. You told someone their haircut looks great even though it didn't. You said that you're on your way before you'd even put your shoes on. Maybe you told your boss you were feeling a little sick when really you were just sick of your boss. Here's the strange part though, we're actually pretty bad at catching each other lying. If you look across dozens of studies on lie detection, humans spot a lie correctly only about 54% of the time, which is basically the same as a coin flip. So let's run a thought experiment. What if lying was illegal? And I don't mean the stuff that's already illegal, like perjury or fraud. Let's include any lie. Anytime you say something you know isn't true. It sounds simple enough, but it's a bit more complex than you think, and not even for legal reasons. The first problem is just technical. Before you can punish someone for lying, you actually have to prove that they did. Well, turns out we've been trying to solve this problem for about 100 years, and none of the usual suspects really cut it. Polygraphs measure stress, not truth, so nervous but innocent people fail them constantly. That's why they're barely admissible in court. Brain scans haven't fared much better. Back in 2010, a doctor actually tried to bring fMRI evidence into court to prove his own innocence, and the judge said no because nobody could even say what the real-world error rate was. On the other hand, an EEG can catch very specific things, like whether you recognize a crime scene photo or not, but it's useless for casual day-to-day lies. And the newest AI models trained to catch lying from your voice or face are only slightly better than a human just guessing. But there might already be a possibility that could help to detect lies. In 2025, a company called Alter Ego released a wearable that sits along your jaw and neck. It's not reading your mind, not exactly. It's picking up something much smaller. The tiny, silent muscle signals your body produces when you talk to yourself inside your head in that half second before you actually say anything out loud. Right now, it's sold purely as a convenience. You can text someone, search something, or dictate a note just by thinking the words. No typing, no talking, nothing anyone around you would even notice. Which is exactly what makes it interesting for our little thought experiment. Because if a device can already read what you're silently saying to yourself, it's not a huge leap to imagine it comparing that to what you actually say out loud. Let's call that version Echo. Same hardware from Alter Ego, same jaw and neck sensors, just one extra function running underneath. Instead of only transcribing your inner voice, it checks it against your spoken one. For example, your friend shows you their new haircut. In your head, a half second before you speak, you think that it looks terrible. Then out loud, you say that it looks great. Echo would catch that gap and log it. Let's look at what would happen to relationships next, because those would get pretty interesting. Relationships are basically where most of our lying happens in the first place. For example, when you tell your partner you love the gift when you don't. Or when you tell a friend their cooking is great when it's fine at best. Most of us tell somewhere between 1 and 2 lies a day on average, and a lot of them are exactly this type of social lubricant to keep things running smoothly. So what actually happens once Echo catches one? Think of it like a parking ticket for a small lie, a small fine, maybe a note on your record. But the system will track your patterns, not just the individual lies. So if you're someone who softens the truth a dozen times a day, that adds up pretty fast. And eventually, you're not only looking at fines anymore, but you're looking at mandatory honesty counseling. The same way repeat offenders get mandated classes for other things. And because the data exists, it doesn't just sit there. Divorce lawyers start using echo logs the same way they use text messages as court evidence today. And suddenly a decade of small, harmless lies about your mother-in-law's cooking could become evidence in a custody hearing. Naturally, people will adapt, but only few will actually get more honest. They just get better at not answering to preserve harmony. People will also stop to ask simple questions like, "How do I look?" because those questions will risk a flag. A hesitation before you speak becomes its own tell, so people either answer instantly with something safe and vague, or they train themselves to say nothing at all. "I'd rather not answer that" becomes a completely normal, socially accepted response in a way it never was before. There will also almost certainly be an entire coaching industry built around this, and it operates completely in the open. I mean, none of it is illegal. For example, courses on how to flatten your inner monologue before you speak, or how to think in vague enough terms that there's never a clear signal for echo to compare against anything. Companies start paying for this training the same way they pay for media training today, because an employee getting flagged constantly is bad for business. The people who get best at it are, unsurprisingly, the same people who were already the best liars to begin with. They just now have a certification for it. So the actual outcome isn't relationships with fewer lies, but a world where we talk to each other less and think even less clearly before we do. When we look at the economical consequences, advertising is a pretty interesting topic because so much of it lives right on the edge of the definition of a lie. Emotional branding, like just do it, isn't a factual claim, so Echo has nothing to compare it against. But the second a company writes clinically proven or the best pizza in town, someone had to type that sentence. And if Echo catches the copywriter's own inner monologue thinking that the claim isn't actually true a half second before they write it, that's a flag. So the marketing industry will undergo some pretty huge changes. Factual superiority claims mostly vanish because they're way too risky to make once there's a paper trail proving someone didn't believe them. What's left is exactly the stuff that was never really lying to begin with, like mood, identity, lifestyle. Ads stop trying to convince you a product is better and just try to convince you it fits your personality, which, if you think about it, was already happening with companies like Apple or Nike. This new law just finishes the job for everyone else. For products that were only ever differentiated by the claims around them, like generic medication, store brand cereal, or any other product basically identical from factory to factory, things will get really tricky. Once you can't legally imply yours is better, there's nothing left to compete on except price. So you get exactly what you'd expect. Aggressive price wars in categories that used to survive purely on branding driving prices down more and more. Companies adapt in a very specific direction too. They stop having humans write the risky copy at all. If an AI writes the ad instead of a person, there's no inner monologue for Echo to catch, because there's no one human actually thinking. Within a couple months, marketing departments will become the most heavily AI-generated writing in the entire economy because it's the only copy that's legally unprovable as a lie. But there will be legal consequences, of course. AIs have to be regulated, so AI will be heavily restricted for marketing usage. And enforcement runs into its own problems as well. Dark patterns, which are basically fake countdown timers and other messages that evoke a feeling of scarcity that are just made up, were already technically illegal in the EU before Echo ever existed. A 2022 sweep found nearly 40% of the online shops checked were using at least one of these tricks anyway. Online shops would have to adapt drastically to stay competitive, so with Echo, you will find less and less dark patterns over time. When it comes to art, most of it wouldn't change. Novels, movies, or stage plays are not trying to deceive you. Nobody watching a movie thinks the events actually happened. This means that disclaimers stop being a legal courtesy and start being something closer to a shield keeping an entire industry outside the law. The real issue is anything that blurs that line on purpose. Reality TV is the obvious one. Most of it is scripted or heavily produced, but marketed to the audience as unscripted and real. This means that it doesn't count as fiction anymore, but that's a factual claim the network is making to millions of people, and it's one they know isn't true. So either the genre has to start disclosing what's staged, the same way some shows already quietly do in the credits, or it gets rebranded as scripted entertainment. Prank shows also land in a weird spot. The moment you trick a stranger on camera, they have no idea they're inside a fictional frame. As far as they know, it's really happening. That's already a legal gray area today, which is exactly why prank shows have always needed the person to sign a release after the fact once the joke's revealed, before any of it can actually air. Add Echo into that mix, and the prankster themselves would get flagged the second they lie to someone's face. The show only stays legal because the target eventually agrees on paper that the deception was allowed. But that would be tied to huge risks. Now that lying is illegal, the one getting pranked could easily sue for damages, so it's more likely that prank shows will slowly die out. Lying will also come at the government's detriment. Let's take police interrogations as an example. Right now, in most places, officers are allowed to flat out lie to suspects to lure out a confession. Courts upheld this back in 1969, and it's still standard practice today. Once Echo exists, an officer doing that would get flagged the same as anyone else. So the system has two options. Actually stop doing it, or carve out an exception for law enforcement specifically. Illinois already banned this exact tactic for minors back in 2021, so there's a real precedent for it changing. But a full ban would take away one of the most common ways confessions get produced in the first place. And that cuts both ways. Those same deceptive tactics are linked to roughly a quarter of the wrongful convictions later overturned by DNA evidence. So losing the tool might mean fewer confessions, but probably fewer false ones too. But that's actually the smaller problem. The problem is that around 98% of criminal cases in the US never go to trial. They end in a plea deal, which basically is a negotiation between a prosecutor and the accused, almost always without a judge or jury ever seeing the actual evidence. And a huge part of how those negotiations work is prosecutors overstating their case. For example, by implying the evidence is airtight, even when the case is a lot weaker than that. If the law and technology label this technique as illegal, this would break the mechanism that keeps the entire court system running. Trials cost roughly 40 times more than a plea deal, and there's no version of the system that can suddenly try even a fraction of that caseload for real. So what does that actually tell us? Turns out, making lying illegal wouldn't actually get you a more honest world. It would just lead to people dodging questions and talking less to each other. Lying is just a part of human nature, and lies are in every aspect of life, wherever you look. You've probably lied today, and you'll do it again a lot of times. Yeah, you obviously shouldn't lie on purpose, but maybe lying a few times is just how humans are built to get along.